Hi, Tzaraim Tovim. This week it's Parshat Tazria Metzora, and I've entitled it About the Women Who Bring Forth Life. And this is particularly in honor of my daughter Rachel and her wife Liz, who just had a baby girl, Rhea Lev. And we're all very, very excited about that. And this is a wonderful new addition to the family. So, in that spirit, let's talk about childbirth and laws of purity and impurity in the Torah, their possible intent, and how they can be grossly misunderstood, misinterpreted, and misused. This is indeed an important discussion, as this double portion may seem cruel, exclusionary, and devoid of kindness and compassion in its discussion of separation, differences of access to community regarding purity and lack thereof, and its general objective and dictating tone. Again, let's try to follow Aviva Zornberg in going under and behind the words and attempt to fill in what might be missing, while not ignoring the obvious concerns that are indeed present here. This is not a matter of apologetics. It is more the recognition that in different types of documents, you have different voices, depending on the goals and the purpose of those documents. The goal in Vayikra is about, first and foremost, purity of the entire community and readiness to be in the Mishkan and later in the Beit HaMikdash, where God's presence, the Shekhinah, is particularly present. Not to say, chas v'chalila, that it is absent in other places, as we know very well that God is omnipresent, along with being omniscient and omnipotent. The discussion is actually quite limited and should not be blamed for the forced isolation that some, extending its literal meaning on their own, may impose. In returning to the human sphere in which we function, we begin this double portion as follows. Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe lemor, daber b'nei Yisrael lemor, isha ki Tazria v'yada zakar v'tamna shivat yamim ki mei nidat data titmei. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, a woman conceives, gives birth to a male. She will be tamei, impure, for 7 days, as the days of her menstrual flow. And on the 8th day, uvayom hashmini yimol basar ar lalo. So, on the 8th day, the flesh of the foreskin of the baby will be circumcised. V'shloshim yom v'shloshet yamim, and for 33 days, the woman, the mother, will remain in the blood of purity. She shall not touch anything holy, nor may she enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification have been completed. And if she gives birth to a female baby, her uncleanliness, her impurity, will be for 2 weeks, like her menstruation period, and for 60 days she will remain al demei tahara, in the blood of purity. When her days of purification have been completed, for a son or for a daughter, she will bring a sheep in its first year as a burnt offering, and a young dove or a turtle dove as a sin offering to the entrance of the tent of meeting to the Kohen. And the Kohen will offer it up before God and effect atonement for her, and thus she will be purified from the source of her blood. If she cannot afford a sheep, she will take 2 turtle doves or 2 young doves, one as a burnt offering and one as a sin offering, and the Kohen will effect atonement for her in the same way. So let us begin with the end of these verses, scripting what the woman who has just given birth is to do before rejoining her community. Our commentators ask the following question: why is the offering of sheep and dove followed by the statement that this is the Torah? Is the offering of the poor woman who can only bring pigeons or doves not also Torah? The classical answer is that the offering of the wealthy woman is the way it ought to be for everyone. That is the Torah. And the Torah acknowledges that there are poor women who give birth, who cannot afford the prescribed offering. But that is a disgrace. It should not be that way. The question then comes up, is the disgrace on the woman, the poor woman, Or is it on the community? You know that phrase we all say in Birkat HaMazon, I've been young, I've been old. I never saw a righteous person suffering or poor or socioeconomically deprived. We know that this is not the case. And the idea here is that this is a responsibility for the community, so that the community should supplement what the woman cannot herself afford. Throughout the Torah, we learn about the ways things should be, and then we talk about the reality of the way they actually are. There's both expression of the ideal and then accommodations for the reality. Our codes of Jewish law amplify this, ensuring that all members of the community can participate as fully as possible in the community. Also an ideal that some of our contemporary folks would do well to remember. The Belzer Rebbe taught, in truth, the Torah of one who gives birth is that she should have the means to bring the offering of the wealthy person. According to the Torah, any woman who gives birth must have her needs met, and more. But it sometimes happens that she has insufficient means, and therefore must be accommodated by the Torah. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that her material and spiritual needs are met? The Torah seems to say that we should not expect God to provide for her. God has made provisions for her in the case that the responsible party fails to do the right thing. Who is the responsible party? It is all of us, of course. As the famous statement from Gemara states, Bavli Shvuot 39a, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zebazeh. All of Israel is tied to and responsible for each other. This is a primary and important lesson. Our community is to see and anticipate and fulfill the needs of our members. This would facilitate pride and gratitude, theoretically. This was part of the motivation for the kibbutz way of life, if you think about it. Today, mostly it's a nostalgic idea, the kibbutz way of life. Secondly, let's consider the differentiation between giving birth to males and females in this text. Rabbi Zev Farber approaches this question by beginning with commentators and classical positions, which, it must be stated, are all provided by males. Vayikra Yud Bet lays out the three-step purification process required of a woman who gives birth. A period of impurity, a period of tahara, meaning either purity or purification, coming back to purity state, and a chatat, a sin or purification offering. The length of the process, however, is dependent upon the gender of the child. If the child is male, the period of impurity is 1 week, like that of a menstruant, and the period of tahara is 33 days, equaling 40 in total, a number of symbolic import, as we know. If the child is female, each segment is double the time frame for the male child. The period of impurity is 2 weeks, and the period of tahara, coming back to purity, is 66 days, the entire period being 80 days. Ancient and medieval Jewish interpreters struggle to explain this different time period for each sex or gender. In traditional Jewish circles, the best-known explanation appears in the Gemara and the Talmud, in which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai explains that a parturient woman must bring a sin offering because she swears never to sleep with her husband again due to the pain of childbirth. Those of you who've been in delivery rooms, I'm sure you can laugh for a moment. I'll give you a second. It continues with a follow-up question and answer from Talmud Bavli Nida 31a. Why does the Torah command 7 days for a male after giving birth to a male and 14 days after giving birth to a female? Sachar shakol smichim bo mitcharetet l'shiv'ah nekeva shakol tzivim ba mitcharetet l'arba'asar. as a female and as a mom of a lot of girls, and many girls, we now have 5 little girls in the next generation, I object to this. But let's stay with the text for a moment. Since everyone is excited about a male child, she has remorse for saying the terrible things she said to her husband and about being intimate with him for a week, because everybody else's happiness overcomes her anger. But for the female, where everyone is quiet and doesn't do anything to celebrate, it takes 14 days for her to overcome her remorse. This is what makes me a big fan of a Simchat Bat. We just had a beautiful Simchat Bat for Ray Alev, and there was joy in that room. And that's the way it should be. Just saying. Notably, even as Rabbi Shimon is taking into consideration the woman's feelings and her experience of pain, he assumes automatically that even the mother strongly prefers having a son over having a daughter. Again, please note my objection. I would imagine that too many of us, myself included, have issues with this. As Dr. Aviva Zornberg explains, many of these forms of ritual impurity are often not understood outside of the very narrow lane of the discussion of purity of the congregational gathering place, if you will. Further, we must remember that mother and infant mortality at many, many times throughout history until relatively recently was very high. And maybe, just maybe, this forced isolation was to allow immune systems to be strengthened and give new mothers and their babies a better chance of survival. I know that many will see this as apologetics, but any of us who have ever been isolated after a medical procedure or illness know that there is definitely credence to this approach. Aviva Zornberg, in addressing this difficult discussion, speaks of a process of transformation from a world of anger to one of compassionate connection. For example, she focuses on the involvement of the Kohen in addressing the one who has leprosy or other mumim, blemishes, as our Parsha continues. These signs may have nothing to do with physical phenomena, but rather could be connected to psychological and emotional concerns that may be manifest through a physical sign. Just look at the commercials on TV about psoriasis or various skin diseases and people wanting to hide themselves. This is not a far leap that we have to take to understand this. Personally, as one who has suffered from eczema and skin infections at various points in my life, I'm open to the notion that stress factors are not unconnected to these physical signs. In some of these instances, taking time off from the community and the public space might be looked at as a kindness. In today's world, think of all of us who are not feeling well on a particular day and should have stayed home to heal, but insist on going out and fulfilling our various responsibilities and obligations. Remember that in terms of the discussion of ritual purity here, we are juxtaposing one's responsibility to be in the gathering with one's personal condition, which might be compromised. What Aviva is proposing, and I am amplifying here, is possible. But the isolation, when mandated, is difficult. Of this there is no doubt. One only has to consider our reality of the past several years in our COVID world, where masks, smaller gatherings, and other restrictions are so challenging to us who are such evolved social beings. Alex Israel gives us yet another way of looking at this separation and the 7-8 pattern of isolation and rejoining the community. He quotes, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch compares this pattern, this 7-8 pattern, to a musical octave. By counting 7 days, the condition of the previous period is entirely closed. And with the 8th day, in the case of a male, with the Brit Milah, a new beginning is made, similar to an octave in music where you enter the higher scale. Just like a musical octave, the opening note is akin to a new beginning. Indeed, it is only reached by the preceding 7 notes. However, the number 8 is not a zenith. It's not a peak. Rather, it is again the first note, the fresh beginning of a new cycle. It is a gateway into a new reality, higher than the previous reality. But it doesn't stop with 8. 8 becomes the number one of the new reality as we leave the previous existence behind. This pattern of 7 and 8 becomes a model of ongoing human progress. Think about graduation, where people think of graduation as the end of something, but it's really the beginning of a new stage. So the point is that the cycle continues and to look at it as that cycle. So let's consider this for a moment. The male child is circumcised on the 8th day, beginning his own new journey in the community. His mother, who has just given birth, completes her days of postpartum impurity just at this point in parallel formation. Could this have anything to do with the differential in the mom's need to re-engage on some level, whereas with a female child, this is not needed as much? So just to understand, in a very concrete way, my daughter and daughter-in-law just had this new baby. The women came and gathered with them in their home. They were surrounded. There's not the sadness. Males, not necessarily in the community in which my children live, not in the LGBTQ community, but in many communities that tend to be very gender divided, the male is immediately scooped up and taken into the male circle, leaving the mother alone. So if you think of that differential, it may speak to the need of the mother for her own gathering, for her own social interaction, and that is what is being proposed here. I know that this will not resonate with all, but it's something to consider. We recently spoke of the pattern of Hekal and the communal gathering after the Shemitah year, which our Chabad friends make a big deal of. This pattern is indeed familiar within the contours of halacha. Again, 7 years, Hekal, you come together. It's the 8th year, and it's the beginning of the new cycle of what will ultimately end in the next Shemitah year. And the formula is consistent with so much else in the rhythm of life as described in the Torah. But again, let's return to the individual and their needs. Aviva Zorenberg, in looking at the many different forms of ritual impurity discussed in this double parsha, observes that there are different chapters of one's life, and that what we might be looking at here are actually redemptive acts that are structured in the law, but felt in a profound way by the person in the rhythm of their own personal life. Now, in other words, while communal structures dictate certain things, we also have to remember the individual and kindness and compassion and how the individual is feeling. And I would like to think that we have evolved as a civilization where we understand that connection and that juxtaposition in a little bit more of a sophisticated way. Although I must confess, sometimes I wonder. This is all to say that we are interfacing individual needs and communal standards, and we will not hit 100% satisfaction on both scores. In fact, it's impossible by definition that this will happen. However, here too, there might be a compromise involved where the best possible solution in all of its imperfections might be the most that can be done on both sides of the equation. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs teaches that we should consider the following factors when learning these complicated texts. He teaches as follows, and this is a long quote. The fundamental concepts that dominate this section of Vayikra, the words tameh and tahor, normally translated as ritually impure or unclean or pure. It is important to note that these words do not have the kind of resonance that they bear in English. Tameh does not mean impure or defiled as we think of it in our everyday lives. It is a technical term, meaning that one is in a condition that only prevents them from entering the tabernacle or temple. Tahor means they may enter. It's very specific. How are we to understand this? The tabernacle, and at a later time the temple, were symbols of the presence of God within the human domain, at the heart of the camp during the wilderness, and at the center of the nation during the years of the monarchy. But they were only symbols because in monotheism we understand that God is really everywhere, equally omnipresent. The very concepts of place and time in relation to God are metaphorical. It is not that God is here rather than elsewhere, but that we as humans feel God's presence here rather than elsewhere. It was essential, therefore, that from a human perspective, the experience of being in the domain of the holy was an experience of pure transcendence. God is eternal. God is spiritual. We and the universe are physical, and whatever is physical is subject to the cycle of birth, growth, decline, decay, and death. It is these things that must be excluded from the sanctuary if we are to have the experience of standing in the presence of eternity. What therefore bars us from entering the holy is anything that reminds us or others of our mortality. The fact that we are born and will one day die, contact with death, or even birth, has this effect. Both therefore debar the person who has had such contact from the domain of the holy. Special though different, processes of purification had to be undergone both by those who had come into contact with death, and by a mother who just gave birth. The same is true of anything that draws attention to our physicality. That is why, for example, people who suffered from the skin disease called sarat, or the flow of menstrual blood, or a seminal discharge, also had to go through a rite of purification. Likewise, a priest with a physical blemish with a mum was disqualified from serving in the priesthood and was precluded from approaching the altar to give various offerings. The woman who had just given birth was therefore tame'ah, not because of the sin of Eve, but because birth, like death, is a sign of mortality, which has no place in the temple, the space set aside for the eternity of God and consciousness of that eternity and spirituality. Coming full circle, back to the new mom. As a new mom, many years ago, my oldest just turned 40, so yeah. I remember appreciating quiet time with my new child and not being so attentive to work and the myriad of details that crowd our lives daily. There was time off, and it is increasingly recognized in our world today, with parental leave applying to both parents of a new baby in many, though perhaps not all and not enough, companies and workspaces. Giving birth is an adjustment, and one does need this time. Is it at all possible to see this as a gift? And another shout out to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which, due to their provisions, both my daughter Rachie and my daughter-in-law Liz are now in parental leave time, becoming the family that they will be from here on out with their new daughter, Rhea Lev. And that is so appreciated. Now, I know that many are thinking at this point, okay, this is all fine, but only if it's my choice. But I don't want to be forced into isolation by external factors. Fair enough. But let's think about this. How many of us have been told by doctors, other medical professions, that those in our lives to rest, take time off, and then we refuse to do it? We need the rest. We need to be exempt from other responsibilities. However, this isolation that ensues is what is overwhelmingly difficult. And this isolation has been cited as leading to or being part of the factors that bring on postpartum depression. Dr. Sharon S. Humanek, PhD, wrote a paper and spoke at a conference on this topic and shared her thinking as follows. Isolation is a frequently mentioned and long-remembered issue for new members in the North American culture. Perinatal educators can play a role in helping new parents build support systems that are designed to diminish the experience of postpartum and new parent isolation. And in this effort, or in her research, she suggests the following. One speaker related her experience of being raised in an African village where the children collectively belong to all of the adults. Re-enter kibbutz. I recalled my visit to families in Bali who lived in compounds that housed several generations. Not only were young mothers close to sisters and grandparents, but they also seemed closely connected to an abundance of great aunts. Few in our North American culture will have such family patterns, but perhaps we need to think more creatively about how we can relieve the isolation experienced by new mothers in our midst. Weekly postpartum gatherings organized by mothers who met in childbirth classes or prenatal exercise classes certainly are a way to connect new mothers. However, for those mothers who feel truly isolated, a weekly event may leave much to be desired. One wonders if social isolation is a determining factor for many mothers who choose to return to employment while their infants are quite young. I personally am filled with gratitude that my 3 female children and their spouses and their children are surrounded by amazing communities who have never and would never leave them isolated. Maybe that is the trick. This is not up to this Parsha for its purpose to ensure the well-being of our new mothers and those whose bodies are recovering from various conditions. Don't blame the Parsha for that. The Parsha does not exclude what we as a community can do to do that. This is up to our community. And if our communities understand that, then we can consider these texts in the very limited context in which they were originally presented. It is up to us to attend to the emotional well-being of those around us. For those of us who are fulfilled and surrounded by such communities in giving birth, in sickness, in whatever challenges we go through, we are so grateful, and we hopefully turn around and return that feeling and that validation to others. And for those who are not in such situations, let us all commit ourselves to working together to make sure that we don't misuse and blame the text, but that we hold the people who are charged with that emotional and social well-being accountable. Shabbat Shalom.